Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. All right, first a couple of reminders. We have our homework 4, which is now due or past due. And then we have last homework of the course. Homework 5 is being posted. Okay, so same thing, you have 1 week to finish it. Okay, and that'll be all the homeworks, okay? Some of you have asking about the grading, so we are working on it. Homework 1, 2 are posted. Homework 3, we're trying to finish the grading as soon as possible. Homework 4, the plan is also like once it's submitted, well, it's submitted right now, so then we'll move on to homework 4 grading. So we're working hard on it. We'll try to post the grades as soon as possible. Homework 5, we may not be able to finish homework 5 grading by the midterm exam, but I have asked our TN grader that will at least like provide a summary of the common mistakes, okay, before the exam, so at least you can review that, okay? And of course, if you have questions, feel free to come to our office hours. Okay, so we have the survey that's posted in Canvas. Okay, so please finish it by today so that we can do the scheduling. Okay, one other thing, so a few students have asked about the midterm exam format, right? So what I have said is that like original plan is that I'm going to do the review next Thursday, and then we're going to post previous 2022, the actual exam copy from previous year so that you can see it, and then we're going to discuss the that exam question on Tuesday. So that's the Tuesday right before the exam. So some of you have asked whether we can post it earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to post it. I will post the 2022 exam copy, okay, in Canvas, okay? It's up to you whether you want to look at it ahead of time or do it when you think you're ready and use it as more like a practice exam, okay? All right, so but just as long you know, our plan is that we are going to do the review, okay, which is like Thursday. We're going to then cover the exam questions on Tuesday, okay? So after this class, I'm going to post 2022 exam copy in Canvas. You should be able to find it under this week, okay? And then you can decide whether you want to see it ahead of time or not, okay? Any questions regarding the remaining homeworks or the midterm exam? Good? All right. Okay, so we are going to continue our discussion with classification, okay? So in the previous lecture, we started talking about chapter 7. So this is based on, like, again, we continue our discussion on classification. So chapter 6, we introduced the basic ideas of classification, talk about some widely used methods. Then we talk about evaluation and using ensemble to improve the accuracy. And then in chapter 7, the idea is that, okay, there are other remaining issues or some of the more like advanced topics that people are exploring to do like further improvement in terms of classification. So we started talking about a few things, okay? First one, feature selection. Quickly, the idea is that how can you identify features, right, that are more useful or more informative for your classifier, okay? So we talk about different ways, right? Either you can do this upfront as more like a pre-processing step, right, using some kind of filter, or you can do that as a wrapper method. So you can you do iterative process of choosing features, building your model, or you can just combine it all together, right? So you have this embedded process, okay? We also talk about Bayesian belief networks, right? So you're all like you just did in homework 4. That's actually doing the naive Bayesian classification, right? So when the naive assumption doesn't hold, meaning that the attributes, right, may have a strong dependency on each other, then we actually use this belief network to capture, right, explicit dependency, okay? And we're using this conditional probability tables to then kind of aggregate, right, the probability giving the dependency on the parent node, okay? We also talk about support vector machines, okay? So the approach, again, is quite different, right? So the idea is that you're using those support vectors, or really just objects, right, along the boundaries, right, to help you to identify this hyperplane, okay, such that you can have a large margin, right, to separate the different classes. Okay, so we talk about how like support vector machine works in a kind of linearly separable case where you can basically just reasonably easily, right, in the original space find a hyperplane. But when that doesn't work, right, when it's linearly inseparable, then you're trying to project into a higher space. Because when you have a higher dimensional space, then things become more sparse. Then you it's more likely for you to find a hyperplane to separate things. Okay, one thing we also mentioned there is about when you use a hyperplane, really you're doing the two-class classification, right? Because you're either on one side or the other side of the hyperplane, okay? So when you have a multi-class classification problem, right, how do you take this binary classifier, okay, and use it for the multi-class classification scenario? So we talk about like one versus or, one versus the other, or like any pair comparison. Okay, rule-based, pattern-based classification, those are also widely used. The idea is that you can generate rules, right? So you can take a decision tree, generate rules that you can use, or you can use your patterns, right? Frequent items patterns can actually also allow you to use some kind of association rule for your classification problem. Okay, we talk about the issue of like coverage versus accuracy, right? Because those are important when you're trying to choose your rules. Okay, of course you want high accuracy and high coverage in all the times, but when you have to trade off, right, you need to consider, right, when you have different rules with different like performance, and when you have multiple rules being triggered, then you just need to do your reasoning about which rules I use or which set of rules I use and in what order. Okay. We also talk about like a weekly supervised learning. Okay, there are actually quite a few of those that are still active research on these days. Okay, so we talk about semi-supervised learning, right? As the name suggests, we're using both supervised learning. That means you have labels, right? Have some labeled data which can use like supervised learning to build a model, but then also you have this unlabeled data, and usually there's a lot of them, right? So you don't want to kind of leave them out, right? They are still useful. Okay. So how you actually combine this? Okay, so we'll talk about like self-training, co-training. Okay, another really topic is about active learning. Okay, so that means when you get to ask right questions or ask for labels, right? How do you choose? You want to be selective, right? We also briefly talk about the transfer learning. That is about like instead of reconstructing everything, right? When you have a new domain, you want to take what you have learned in the original domain or the source domain and then try to transfer the knowledge over, okay? So that is usually helpful when you have, say, good like labeled data, good model built for like source domain, and you have limited label, limited data in the targeted domain. So you want to be able to utilize, right, what you have already learned. Okay, so at the very end of a previous lecture, we started talking about classification with rich data types. Okay, so there are, as we have mentioned, right, many different types of data. Okay, so one particular one is stream data. Okay, so we have been using this fraud detection scenario. Thinking about how you can deal with, right, this almost infinite data stream, and it's coming in quickly, right? So this really kind of brings out this challenge about the data is continuously coming in, you're observing it as it goes, and you need to make a decision soon, right? So you need to make almost like real-time, near real-time decision, and your model can change, or the behavior can change, right? So you want to be able to adapt, right, as new data comes in. Okay, so instead of this kind of like traditional approach where say you train your model, update it when you have when you have new data, we're taking this bit of a more like ensemble approach, right? So what we're basically doing is that we're just breaking those infinite stream into chunks, okay? So each chunk now allows us to build a kind of a weak classifier, right? Okay, now the ensemble basis is, okay, I want to take those chunks or those different classifiers and combine them. Okay, so here weighting is important, right? Because apparently when you have like like a stream data, right? So the current information is important, and usually more important than historical information. So you want to leverage historical information, right? So the models you have built like before, but weigh them like not as much as the current data. Okay, so over time, right, you're always having the latest information, but also utilizing your historical information. And if there's any shift in terms of underlying behavior, your model will be able to like capture that as well. Okay, so that's stream data. Okay, related to that is sequence data. Okay, so earlier when we talk about frequent pattern mining, right, we say you could have frequent item sets, right? But also if it's a sequential data, you could have frequent like subsequences, okay? So with the sequence classification, you can, again, the idea is that you have different sequences come in and you want to be able to determine what they are, okay? So there are, of course, many different types of sequences, okay? So here I have a diagram just showing like some sequences you may see in the like biology side, right? They're dealing with all kinds of sequences. A lot of times they're trying to look for similarities, right? So things that look similar so that you may be able to infer like similar functionality or similar reaction in different scenarios, okay? So there's actually a lot of feature engineering, because meaning that, okay, when you have sequences, right, what features are important, okay? So there are some kind of basic one, which is called n-gram, right? So n-gram basically just every time you're taking the neighboring, like n symbols, and see whether they represent something like unique, right? So one example that's from my research work, right? We were looking at the kind of, we're using Wi-Fi signals. Okay, so Wi-Fi signal, you know, like in any particular place, you may have multiple access points, right? And now you're trying to use that to like locate, right, which room you're in, okay? Because apparently, depending on which room you're in, you may be seeing the access points from different angles, and they may have different, like the signal, right? Some signal may be stronger from certain access point, and the others may be like weaker, right? So we also developed some kind of n-gram-based approach. The general idea is that I want to just sort the access points, okay, based on their signal strengths, okay? So the idea is that, okay, if I'm always seeing kind of A going before B, that means I'm closer to A, like access point A, than access point B, right? So those n-gram actually allow us to have a kind of a nice, kind of rough kind of zoning in terms of where you are, okay? So by combining this together, we were able to come up actually very good like classification approach, like in terms of identify which room you're in, just based on those like n-grams of the sorted access point signals. Okay, but there are also other ones to do it, right? You can use the distance measure, right? So distance similarity is actually something we generally use, right, when we're trying to identify similar or different items, okay? So with the sequence data, right, of course, you can still do Euclidean distance, okay? So that means you can just line them up, right, and then have some way of measuring how similar they are. There's another term, actually I should put it down here, is about edit distance. I don't know how many have like seen that kind of distance measure. So the edit distance is that if you take one sequence, right, you want to change it into the other one, okay? So what kind of edits you need to do? Okay, so you can swap things, you can add like a gap, or you can remove things, right? So there are a few operations you can do to make edits so that one sequence becomes the other sequence. So apparently, if two sequences are very similar, then the edit distance will be smaller, meaning that you don't need many edits, right? So that is another way to do it. Another interesting measure is this dynamic time warping, okay? So the high-level idea is that, okay, I have two kind of sequence, right? They're kind of occurring along time, but they don't perfectly align, right? So that means like some event may take longer. So you say instead of this one-to-one mapping, now you say, okay, I can allow some kind of shifting or lagging. Okay, think about like a commute or trajectories, right? So maybe today the bus took a little bit longer to arrive, right? So instead of let's say like 10 minutes, it took me 20 minutes, right? But if you look at the sequence, they would still align up even though this chunk like took a little bit longer. So that's the high level idea in terms of like dynamic time warping. So you're trying to map things along the sequential order, but allowing potential kind of like adjustment, right? Some components may take a little bit longer or shorter, okay? There are also other things. So kernel function, this is actually related to the support vector machine, right? You project into a higher dimensional space, right? And then look for similar, right, features in the high dimensional space, okay? I also put up another example. This is actually of like Markov chain model, okay? So what you're trying to do here is that, so Markov chain basically just looking at the transition probability, okay, between different states, right? So for example, when you have seen this thing happened, then what's the chance that the next thing will happen? Okay, so this can be applied to, for example, the DNA sequence, right? If you have ACGT, if you have seen A, what's the probability you would see like G? What's the probability you will see C afterwards? Okay, so you basically use this model to calculate, right, the transition probability. Okay, and then if you look at different sequences, right, you say, okay, whether this sequence belongs to this class or not. Okay, what you're basically doing is that you take this sequence and then calculate, right, the probability. Okay, because you have this model, the model has certain transition probability for the combined sequence. Okay, so taking this sequence, applying that model, then you can see how often do you see, like what's the likelihood, right? The probability you're seeing this model generating this sequence. And that would then allow you to classify whether this sequence belongs to this class or not. Okay, so there's actually a lot happening because especially when you're dealing with sequence data, right? So it's challenging, but there are quite a bit of kind of like different approaches and some like interesting ideas that you could apply when you're trying to look at, right, certain properties of your sequence. Okay. One more. Okay, we'll talk about sequence and we'll talk about graph. Okay, so graph is again, very broad, right? It can occur in many different settings, okay? We already said, right, there may be physical networks, right, that can be represented as graphs, but there are also all kinds of abstraction you can use, right, to create graphs to represent certain relationships among certain entities, okay? So with those graphs, right, then some of the tasks when we say classification is that, okay, what are you trying to do, right? Are you trying to classify like individual vertices? Right, so for example, you like within a graph of say different authors, right? Then you are trying to classify whether they are like publishing, they will publish in certain area, right? So that's a yes or no classification, okay? But on the node level, okay? Or you can take a whole graph. Right, so could, for example, like the protein 3D folding could be a graph, right? And then you're trying to look for like proteins with similar functionalities. Now you're actually classifying at the graph level to see whether they're like belong to the same class. Okay, so meaning that they have a similar functionality. Okay, how to do it? Still, right? Feature engineering is still widely used, right? So a lot of times I would say feature engineering is really about you trying to dive deeper into your data, understanding some of the kind of the characteristics of your attributes or some of the domain knowledge that you're trying to capture, okay? So ultimately what you want is that you're taking those graphs or taking those vertices, right? You're trying to come up with attributes to describe them. Okay, so for example, if you want to identify like somebody, right, the author, right, in the community, right, so you can use what kind of, like all kinds of information, right, what kind of paper they have published, whom they have co-authored with, which venues they have published at. So those are all information you can utilize, right, to represent, right, a particular vertex, okay? With a graph, you can have some graph level properties. For example, the size of graph, the connectivity of the graph, right? And sometimes you can do the some hierarchical structure, right? You may be able to infer. So all those are ways that you may be able to utilize, right? So those are features or attributes, right? You can extract from those graphs to represent different properties. Okay, and of course, like nowadays with deep learning, right? Actually, a lot of those kind of feature engineering can be done, right, through some kind of automated training. Okay, but that's assuming you have quite a bit of data, right? You need a lot of data in order to kind of train those kind of like automated neural networks. Okay, but it's doable. Okay. There are also ways like for you to measure proximity, right? We mentioned the KN before when we talked about lazy learning, right? So instead of looking at the global structure, instead we're looking for some kind of local, right, like neighbors, right? Local nearest neighbors. So you may have some way of defining, maybe instead of looking at the whole graph, you say, okay, there are certain structures, right? So for example, this is star-shaped structure, or this kind of full clique structure, like everybody's connect to everybody kind of thing. Or you have like nice hierarchical structure. So all those are things you may be able to utilize when you're looking for local, like similar like objects, okay? And that will then, again, then allow you to find the things that may be similar or belong to the same class. Okay, with that, I think I have a couple more really techniques. Okay, so if you look at the textbook and if you look at the like current publications, right, classification continues to be an active research field, right? Even though we have already, right, come up with quite a few very good methods for classification, right, under different scenarios. They have been reasonably successful, but still like just continue the research, okay? So I briefly mentioned a couple, right? The textbook has more details and the reference have more details. But hopefully those are just pointers so that you can look into them further if needed, okay? So we mentioned earlier about this multi-classing when we talk about support vector machines, right? The high level thing is really about, okay, different classifiers have different ways of doing the classification, right? Some of those can handle multi-classes naturally, okay? Some of them is only binary, right? So when you have binary classifiers and you want to use them for multi-class classification, basically just need to build multiple classification problems, right? So convert that into multiple binary classification problems, okay? So high level things like this one versus all. So it's like, are you in class A or not? Class B or not? Class C or not, okay? Versus, is it a class A or B? Class A or C, right? Class B or C. So you're basically doing the pairwise binary classification, okay? And more recent, there are actually some kind of other research that's related, okay? So inside this kind of multi-class thing, okay, generally with classification, the idea is that you classify each object into one class, right? Okay, but in some scenarios, so it may be useful to be able to like class this object into multiple classes. So that's the multi-label classification scenario. So that means a particular data object may belong to multiple classes, okay? One or more classes, okay? So this is kind of newer research. We're not really going to the detailed discussion, but if somehow that applies to your problem, you can search up more on multi-label classification, okay? Another one, we always talk about the interpretability, right? Because with the data mining, there's always this aspect about whatever you find, right? How do you explain it, right? Can you interpret your results, okay? Because the data mining ultimately is you want to gain knowledge, right, from your data, okay? So that's why I say if you analyze your data or you build a model, right, you don't just put up a figure or put up a table and say, here you go, this is my result. What does it mean, right? What do we learn from it, okay? So with the classification, apparently, if you just look at this pure black box, right, solution, right? So black box, it tells you the classification, a result, which label it should be. And turns out it's pretty accurate, great, right? But do you just use it, right? And trust it that it will be just knowing that, oh yeah, using my evaluation seems to be working well, right? It's good, I can use it, right? But in many times, people do want to understand, right, how the decision is made, right, how the classification result is being determined, okay? We want to be able to explain it, okay? So we have some good examples, right? Decision tree induction, linear classifier, those are actually all easy to explain models, right? Decision tree, you can literally, right, follow exactly how you come to the leaf node to make the decision. So you say, okay, I classify this object as this particular class because of those attribute values, and that is my branching conditions, right? So you can clearly explain, okay? But there are many other scenarios that is not so obvious, right? Think about support vector machines, right? And sometimes even a Bayesian belief networks, if you have some kind of hidden structure or hidden variables, right, it can be difficult to explain, Okay, so there are different approaches, right? People, of course, trying to come up with ways to explain things. Okay, so here is one example. Okay, this is called local interpretable model agnostic explanation. Okay, so model agnostic, that means that's good, right? I don't care. Well, I don't like it. Doesn't do like depend on how a particular model come up with the classification decision, right? But as long as I have some way, right? So this is a black box model. I don't know what the model is, but it is giving me classification decisions, right? So in any case, right? So like for example, you have this tested like tuple, right? So that's the one I like to explain how I come up with that decision. Okay, so what we do is that instead of trying to explain the whole model, right, we look at in a kind of like a neighborhood, right, vicinity of this test tuple. Okay, so we say within this neighborhood, right, I find a few other cases, right, positive ones, negative ones. Okay. Again, I don't know how the model is coming up with that decision, but this is what I see, right? So now within this neighborhood, right? Now I'm trying to use some kind of approximation, right? This is what I call a surrogate model. So I basically say, okay, here I have seen this as a positive, this as a negative, right? So I'm basically trying to use, instead of this kind of complicated curved or whatever structure, which I don't know, right? But I can use some kind of like linear separation, okay? So that in a way allows to explain how I'm making the decision about a positive or negative, but for that neighborhood, okay? All right, so this is just one approach, of course, right? There's actually a lot of active research on just generally like explainable AI, right? So some of them may depend on the specific problem you're looking at. Sometimes it may depend on the model, but a lot of times people are really trying to have something that is more generic, right? For different models, can you actually have a way to explain this? And this approach is a reasonable, effective one. All right, another one. This term has been introduced quite some time ago, and has been around for many time. Okay, for a lot of time already, and then now they're still being used in different settings. There were time periods like this genetic algorithm is actually very, very popular and has been shown to be really powerful. So as the name suggests, right, it's actually trying to kind of mimic, okay, how the kind of genetics work. Okay, so natural evolution. Okay, so if you have general biology class, they talk about how you may have different kind of like at the very end you have different species. Okay, they have different characteristics. Okay, but then there's a bit of kind of like a fitness of the survival of the fittest, right? So the idea is that whatever properties, right, that each species or this organism have, right, their characteristics would give them certain chance of survival or not. Okay, so the ones that of course will be will not survive, they will be eliminated, right, from your pool anyway. But the ones that actually survived, right, now they have the chance to evolve further, okay? So the further evolvement is usually through some kind of genetic, what is called crossover mutation. And then there's a new pool, right, of those new species, and then continue the process, okay? So the high-level idea, right, with genetic algorithm is usually to do that, right? Because I want to come up with a model that works well, okay? So I start with, right, a few different options, okay? And then just I need some way of measuring the goodness, right? Or whether the model is performing well, okay? But suppose I have a way of measuring that, and I have some candidate, right, models to start with, okay? Now I can use that process, right, to eliminate the ones that are not good, okay? And then continuing improving, right, the existing ones, the ones that actually survived. Okay, so this is an iterative process. Okay, until at some point, say there is a particular threshold that says, okay, they're all good, or the model that I have right now is good enough. Okay, so The process seems quite simple, right? But of course, for any particular problem, you need to decide, right? What is your initial model, how you do the crossover, how you do the mutation, right? How you define the fitness measure. Usually, there are some domain knowledge that will allow you to, right, build up the initial setup. And they have been shown to be quite effective, right, in many settings, okay? I haven't seen much, how to say, comparative study in terms of genetic algorithms versus the newer advances. So I cannot say for sure, but if you're interested, definitely you can look up more, and maybe some like comparison could be of interest just to see like how like genetic algorithm may compare with some of the newer advances. Okay, one more, reinforcement learning. Okay. You may have seen this if you paid attention to some of the like the chess player like or some of the like design in terms of how you can like some of the like winning strategies, right? I think a couple of the teams actually are talking about like potentially, right, looking at reinforcement learning in your work. So at a high level, right, how is the reinforcement learning different from the like classic like classification problem? Okay, so remember with the classification, right? Our training data, the labels or the kind of supervision, right, we get is what we call instructive. So that means I tell you whether like what the true label should be, right? Okay, so if you give me a like particular training sample, I tell you this is a class label that it belongs to. Okay, so it's a definite, right, feedback. Okay. Well, with the reinforcement learning, this scenario will say, okay, every time you do something, okay, I don't tell you whether it's a winning or lose or correct or not, right? Rather, I have some kind of measure telling you like some kind of reward function, okay? So that's more like, okay, if you do this, I'll say there are some ways that either you're getting better to winning, but like I don't give you a definite answer in terms of win or not, right? Because think about it, if you're playing chess or you're playing in a game, usually a single action, right, may not be sufficient, right, for you to get to the final like result, okay? Rather, it's just a way of saying whether this is improving certain way, okay? Sometimes you can only really observe, right, to some extent, right, how this is helping or not. Okay, so because of this feedback, right, is different, right? So we call it evaluative feedback. So basically you try something and see how it's helping you or not, okay? So ultimately what you want to find a good strategy to play, right? So instead of about like just a decision making for each step, rather say, okay, what kind of strategy like you can apply, okay? And usually you're trying to like work with some kind of reward function, okay? So this multi-armed bandit problem is kind of like an important foundation, right? Whenever people are talking about reinforcement learning, okay? So the setting is simple to some extent, right? So this is a slot machine, okay, with multiple arms, and each arm corresponds to an action. So that means you have different strategies or different things you can play. So think about like advertisement, right? You can decide to do advertisement on a particular product or different types of advertisement, okay? But you don't know, right, the ultimate winning value yet, right? So you need to find out each action to take, basically like which action you want to take. So if you are designing this online advertisement like strategy, what do you do, right? So from your side, of course, you can have different actions, meaning that you can run different campaigns, right? The different things you can control in terms of your actions, okay? But then what you will observe is ultimately is how successful the advertisement is, right? Click-through rate or actual purchase, okay? So you can use those information to help you in a way to evaluate, right, the effectiveness of your actions. And over time, then you build up your strategy, okay? So this general domain is actually very, very active. So there's actually a lot of research going on trying to figure out, right, different strategies in either like competitive or cooperative or in a team setup. So there's a lot of things that can be generally applicable in many real-world settings, okay? So if you're interested, look further. But we are not covering all the like technical details there, but there is a lot happening in the field. Okay, so this brings us to the end of chapter 7, okay? But as you can see, right, chapter 7, even though we're talking about advanced classification, we're really just pointing to different directions, right? The different aspects that there's a lot more active research going on that you can potentially look into, okay? It's too big a field, very active, right? So really it's about knowing that there are those directions, okay? And then depending on your problem at hand, depending on what you're interested in, you can pursue further, okay? Just knowing that there's a lot of active research. And a lot of time really just goes back to your real world problem, right? Because when you look at your real world problem and you see what has been developed already, okay? See how they're performing on your problem and then see, okay, there's not quite, or like I have a new problem setting that hasn't been addressed by the existing ones. Or I have a particular scenario that may benefit from further improvement of those methods, right? So those are all things that really motivate, right, more research. And then that's why it's exciting, right? We keep kind of coming up with more solutions for newer problems, okay? All right, okay, so we have talked about classification. Now we have the other part, which is also widely used in data mining, and you may have heard about in many different settings, okay? This is called cluster analysis, or clustering, okay? So chapter 8, we'll talk about the basic concepts and the methods, and then we'll also have some more advanced discussion later. Okay, starting point. What is a cluster, right? What do we mean by cluster analysis? Okay, so the term cluster really just says things that tend to group together, right? So they're like if you kind of look at your data objects, right? So in this case, it's unsupervised. As I said, we don't have a label. We don't have predefined classes that we can just assign, right, those objects into the different categories. Rather, you put the objects together, like if you do projection visual or something, then you can see they tend to be closer. So instead of this kind of uniform spread, right, in your space, you tend to see certain objects, right, they're closer to each other, okay? And there are different clusters, right? So that means that you have a blob here where a lot of objects are close to each other. You have another blob here where they're also close to each other, but they're pretty far, right, from the other blobs. Okay, so that's the general idea, and the notion is really simple, right? If you say that really is about like intra-cluster similarity, so that means within the cluster, things are similar. Okay, and also inter-class similarity should be low. So that means that between clusters, they're different. Okay, so notion is simple, right? The question, of course, is that how do you find those clusters, and why do we even care? Okay, so with cluster analysis, right, the general idea is that if you're looking at the data sets, right, in the real world, okay, typically, right, you don't see this purely uniform distribution. Because if it's so uniform, then it's really not much information there, right? So it's like there are patterns, right, or those kind of like characteristics we're looking for usually means that there's some non-uniform distribution in your data set. Right? So especially when you don't have, like, say, predefined labels yet, you're basically just exploring your data. You want to find those clusters, right? So that you can capture some, like, characteristics, right, based on those clusters. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do, right? We want to find potentially clusters, or say there's no cluster, right? Everything's uniform. That's one thing, right? But if you do have clusters, you want to be able to find it, okay? But the question is that how do you do it, right? Because with clustering, there are different algorithms, but the core is really about the similarity, right? How do you define things being similar versus different? Because that's really the base for you to be able to like separate things, right? As we said, this is unsupervised, right? That means I don't have any predefined labels, right? You just give me the data, which are represented by their attributes, right? There's no grouping, no pre-classification anyway, okay? Now, when do we use this? Right? What kind of data, right? Because when you talk about data mining, there's this knowledge view. That's what we're trying to find clusters, right? But what kind of data? Because the different types of data may require very different clustering approaches, okay? So simple one, if you have, say, numerical data, right? Numerical data, you can probably present it in a n-dimensional space, and then like trying to find clusters in this kind of n-dimensional space. Okay, 2D is probably easy. You can probably just visualize it. 3D may still be manageable, but when you have higher dimensions, right, how do you actually identify those clusters? Okay, so that's numerical data. When you have categorical data, okay, category data between, like, numerical data and category data, one main thing is that numerical data, you can calculate the, arithmetic mean, right? You can compute, let's say, centroid, which we'll talk about later, okay? With category value, you cannot take a red and the blue and find some kind of mean value, right? Just they have to be one or the other, okay? So in that case, then how do you define, right, the cluster when you have very different categorical values? Okay, text data, right? A lot of times people take paragraphs, people take documents, and trying to find like clusters of documents, right? So search engine actually, they do actually quite a bit of that, right? But more recently, people have been talking about like summaries, right? Because when you have, say, a lot of news articles or a lot of social media posts, right? So you want to be able to say, they're generally talking about those things, right? This is related to topical modeling. Okay, some of the projects are going to use that, right? So it's like what topics, right, are people talking about? Okay, so that's the grouping, the clustering we're looking for, right? When you have text data, okay, multimedia data, images, right? Categorization of images, right? So when you have predefined labels for images, that's classification. But when you don't have anything, I just give you, right, a lot of images or a lot of audio, video data, right? Can you group them into some natural clusters, right? Because that would allow us then to identify there are certain like patterns in your data set, okay? Adding more, making it a little bit more complex, right? Time series data, sequential data, stream data, graph data, right? So those are all kinds of information that you can just throw into your like analysis and trying to say, do we see a cluster? Because ultimately you're looking for potentially, right, similar things, okay? Uncertain data, like that we're not really getting into all that, but it's actually getting more and more useful these days. Because a lot of times when you have data, right, and you know the data is noisy or they have some kind of like fidelity or uncertainty like associated with it, right? So can you actually cluster those objects knowing that they're fuzzy information there, okay? Also, when you're doing clustering, right, there are other information you can leverage, okay? A lot of times people use visual insights, right? So that's why I say with data mining, or visual analytics, right, it's very powerful, right? Sometimes really like a picture says 1,000 words, right, or more than 1,000 words, right? So instead of having, say, if you have a lot of data points going through the spreadsheet, it probably would not be very helpful. But if you project it somewhere, you can probably already find some interesting patterns, right? We had like examples like the correlation earlier, right? But if you just project things up, you can probably easily see potential clusters, okay? So visual insights is very useful, okay? Semi-supervised, okay? It's also very powerful here. This is a particular scenario where say, well, I cannot give you the perfect label, right, that they all belong to this class or not, but I can give you some information about those objects should go into the same cluster. Those objects should go to another cluster, or those objects cannot be in the same cluster, right? So you have some kind of those kind of guidance, right? Even though it's not completed like ground truth label, but help you to separate or group things in certain way. Validation is also important because many times when you put things into clusters, you need a way to say, hey, are they actually good clusters or not, right? So we'll be talking about how you actually evaluate, right, a cluster is good or not, so that you can validate whether you actually find meaningful clusters, okay? Now we say, okay, we can do this, right? Why do we care, right? How this can be particularly useful? There are actually many applications. Okay, so like a lot of times you say like I have different types of data. I want to just have a good sense of what my data look like, right? So this is some kind of summarization, right? Okay, so when you have clusters, right, you can summarize your data, the individual data points using those clusters, okay? And that'll give you a better understanding, right? And that also allow you to do further, right, in terms of the characterization of those clusters, okay? It also enables this compression and reduction. That's important, right? Because when you can cluster them together, now those many data points, right, can now be represented by each individual clusters, right? You have much smaller representation of your data, okay? Another one, this is related to recommendation, okay? So the inherent property that recommendation systems are leveraging is about similar, right? What do you mean by similar, okay? You want to find people with a similar interest. You want to find products that can be bought by similar people, right? So it's about the item clusters, people clusters, by knowing that each of us probably have different interests, right? So, and it may have multiple interests, okay? So that way, so you need to just put one person into one class. Sometimes you say, okay, in terms of say, what type of movies you like, in terms of what kind of food you like, right? So you can actually be grouped differently in different settings. But all those clusters allow us to find similarities, right? And similarities is what we're leveraging when we're making recommendations. Because if you have similar interests, then if they like this, then you are likely to like those items as well. Okay, so that's what a lot of recommendation systems are leveraging, right? So you want to have those kind of clusters. Dynamic trend detection. Okay, this can be very useful whenever you're doing some kind of prediction, right? Stock price or traffic pattern, weather conditions, all things, right? If they're changing over time, and you're trying to look for things that are similar, right? They're changing certain patterns, okay? That is what you can try to find through clusters. Of course, here you're clustering some kind of a time series or sequential data, right? So that you can identify the trends of change, okay? We're in the middle of the flu season, okay? If you want to look at it, I think we use Google Trend at the very beginning of the class, right? If you play with it, if you search certain keywords, you can see how things are changing. You'll probably see certain things change similarly, okay? So some of those trends, right, the similarity of those trends, right, would allow us to identify clusters, okay? And that is the information we can leverage for trend prediction, okay? A lot of other data, right? So the multimedia data, biological data, social network analysis, right? They utilize all kinds of clustering approaches, right? They naturally have some text data, multimedia, network data, sequence data, right? All those information you can utilize and sometimes combine, right? So that you can identify various clusters, okay? And use that to either make recommendations. Sometimes if you're pushing predicting the popularity of a certain post or understanding the general opinion of your population, all those things would be useful if you had those clusters, right, identified. Okay. Also, clustering is not separate from other research, right? They actually enable further investigation. So, for example, classification, right? Classification assumes that you have some predefined labels. But how do you get the label or the classes, right, to start with? So if you have clusters, right, so if you say start with a data set, you have no idea what they look like, right? Through cluster analysis, now you have identified some major clusters. You can now define those, right, as your categories or classes, okay? Now you have those labels, right? You can then use further for classification. Okay? And a lot of this pattern discovery, hypothesis generation testing, they can build upon, right, your understanding of the clusters. Okay? Later on, we'll also be talking about outlier detection. Okay? So the general notion of outlier just say if you're different, right, from others, okay, then you're considered an outlier. But how do you define the others or majority, right? Those are usually clusters because when you're in the class, that means you're kind of norm, or you're in a kind of more the majority setting, right? So if things that are very different, right, or they're far away from certain clusters, right, they're considered different. So we'll be talking about quite a bit of the how you can use clusters to detect outliers. Okay, so cluster analysis can be really useful and really fundamental. Okay, but let's get into some of the technical aspect, right? Okay, what are needed, right? So if you say, okay, I want to do some kind of cluster analysis, right? But what are the requirements and the correspondingly challenges, right, to make this work? It's Scalability, this is very important because, as we have said, right, if you have a smaller number of data points, it's probably easy. Most methods, even like a reasonable brute force approach, can probably give you okay, right, result in terms of clustering, right? You can just try to put them, right, in different ways and see which one works better. But when you have large number of data points, and when you have high dimension, like dimensionality, that like the clustering probably becomes much harder. Okay, so that's why a lot of the challenges really say if you want to run clusters on like clustering on say 1 million data points versus 1 billion data points, right? Or when you have things like coming in like quickly, right? So all those are things that you need to consider to think about like how much you need to do, right, to make your method more efficient. Okay. Different types of attributes, we have said, right? There are very different data types, right? So when you're doing clustering using numerical data, it's quite different from like categorical information or graph information, okay? Arbitrary shape, that's important, okay? So the high-level idea is that when you generate clusters, right, just visually in the 2D place, okay? Ideally, right, you would like a way to draw arbitrary shapes so that you can separate things, okay? But quite a few methods, some of the widely used ones, right, they may not do that, just based on the way they're designed, okay? Because typically they're searching for a certain space, right? They have certain way of constructing their clusters, okay? So when you're looking at your problem, just say, okay, for my particular problem, is it important that my clustering method can handle arbitrary shapes? Okay, some of them can, some of them cannot. Okay, minimal domain knowledge for parameters. What does it mean? Number one question: if you're looking for clusters, right? To start with, how many clusters are you looking for? Do you even know? Right? Sometimes, oh, if I have domain knowledge, I say, yeah, I expect I will have 3 clusters. Okay, great, right? But to what extent you have that information, right? So some methods require you to specify how many clusters you're looking for. Okay, other methods can be more adaptive, right? They will automatically like find the clusters as long as there are some. Okay, also noisy data. Okay. This is a challenge because with clusters, right, as you can see, you look at the things as a whole, right? So ideally, say if like everything is kind of close to each other nicely in this blob, but in the real world, when you have noisy data, the noisy data may be pulling things along, right? So you say, okay, there's something kind of at the boundary or near the boundary of the cluster. Do you include it or do you not, right? If you include it, that may make you too close to another site, and that actually may kind of say, generate some kind of like confusion or even overlap, right, with another cluster, okay? So that also gets to the point about to what extent, right, your method can handle noisy data, okay? Incremental, insensitivity to input order. Those are also important, right? As I said, if you have data that's not just a single snapshot, you will get the new data, right? Do you need to redo everything when you have new data, okay? And also, would the order like matter? Because sometimes it may be depending on the sequence of things being generated, right, or being transferred, right? You may have different results. And is that important or not? Okay. Finally, high dimensionality, constraint-based, interpretability. All those are like terms we have been talking about, right? All those are important as you're coming up with your methods. So let's look at a few. Always, there's no just one method, right? We have a few, so that's we need to understand like how they work and their pros and cons. Okay, so the first one is called partitioner methods. Okay, this one is simple. The general idea is that okay, you want K clusters, I'll just figure out a way to assign those data points, right, into those K clusters. So based on partitioning my data points. Okay. Second one is a hierarchical method. Okay. So partitioner usually say you need to tell me, K, right? How many clusters you want, okay? But in many real-world settings, you don't know upfront, right? And sometimes it may change depending on the granularity you're working with, okay? So hierarchical methods actually try to look at this at a different granularity, okay? So they can be more adaptive, and usually they can give you clusters at a different granularities, so which is actually very powerful in some real-world cases. Third one, density-based, okay? So as the name suggests, right? If you have clusters, you tend to have denser areas, right? If you just draw some kind of neighborhood, right? If there's a cluster, you will have more data points. So that's the density, okay? So there are actually some mechanism to use the density to identify clusters, okay? One more, grid-based, okay? So this one, the idea is that instead of trying to work with the data points, I'm going to work with the space. That means once you give me the space, I basically divide up the space, okay? So as I divide up the space, I count, right, how many data points are in a particular space, okay? So when I get to some areas that are with more data points, that is the grid cells that I'm going to call a cluster, okay? So we'll look at each of these categories and see how they work and how they compare. There are a few more. Later on, we'll also talk about like model-based, okay? Meaning that instead of trying to kind of divide data points, you'll say you make some assumption that your data being generated by certain distributions or certain models. So now what you're trying to do is really just trying to fit your data points, right, into those models, okay? We also talk about later on high-dimensional data. That's a challenging problem. Constraint-based, which is also good, right? We mentioned earlier, in many real-world data mining problems, you don't just run a generic one because you have some focus, you have some knowledge you may be to utilize, right? So you can apply constraints in terms of what kind of clusters, right, you want to generate, okay? So I can use some of this like semi-supervised approach, meaning that you add in some hints, right, as constraints when you're constructing your clusters. All right, okay, so let's start with a classic approach, okay? So this is a partitioning method, right? As I said, right, we have n data points to start with. They're represented by certain attributes, right, the attribute values, okay? Now you're provided with k, okay? So say, okay, I want to take this n data points, put them into k clusters, okay? Such that within the cluster, they're similar, between the clusters, they're not, they're different, right? So that's a high-level thing, okay? Now, if you want to get the global optimal, you can do this, right? Basically, just a brute force approach, right? You have k clusters. Each object can go to one of the k clusters, okay? So you look at all the possible combinations, all right? But that's a big number, right? Because you have k clusters. Each one has a k, like each point have k different positions, okay? So that's the combination, right, of all the different n data points across these k clusters, which turns out to be a very big number. So it's not feasible for any reasonably large like n and k, okay? So instead, we're using some kind of heuristic method, okay? So k-means is broader use, it's wider use. Nowadays, like it's almost the, how to say, one clustering method like everybody will try first, right, before they try something else, okay? So k-means is a broader use, okay? The idea is that you're using this mean or the centroid, right, to assign the objects. The high-level idea, if you're close to the centroid of one cluster, I'll assign this data point to that cluster. Simple, right? There is another one that is for when you don't have numerical value, because remember means or centroid, right? You need some kind of numerical value to do the calculation, okay? But k-medoid, that is when you are using just the object themselves, okay, as the center or centroid, okay? All right, so let's see how the k-means method work, okay? So starting point, right? Usually you need to start with the initial k clusters, okay? So, so my goal is that I have n objects, right? I need to partition those objects into k clusters, okay? And they are non-empty. That means like each cluster should have some or at least one object, okay? How do I do this? Okay, so the first, right? So you say, okay, I need some initial centroid. Okay, so you can do this randomly, okay? So the basic, like the classic k-means method, just say, yeah, randomly pick your k centroids to start with, okay? So once you have it, like you just compute, right? So you can assign objects to the closest centroid. So that's the idea, right? If you have 1, 2, 3, 4, k centroids for each object, right? So you go through each object, so that's a loop of n, okay? And then you go check, right? Calculate the distance to each of the centroids and assign your object to the closest one. So that's big O of n, big O of k, right? So that's one round. So in one round, you do this assignment, okay? But that's just one round. You're not, like, you need to, like, adjust it, right? So once you have done the assignment, okay, now you need to update, okay? So you go back, right? You need to repeat, because now once you have changed the points being assigned to a cluster, the centroid of that cluster need to be updated, right? Okay, so you look back, okay, update your centroid, okay? Now with the new centroid, you redo your assignment process. Okay, so that's the iteration, right? So if you look at our illustration here, so that's basically like, say, at the very beginning, okay, I have, like, you probably cannot see this clearly, so I have this plus sign. These are the 3, so I need to generate 3 clusters, okay? So I randomly pick those at the 3, okay? Once I have that, now I'm assigning data points, right? So for example, what has changed? Okay, so for example, this data point, right? Now it goes into this one. So it's closer, say, to this point. Okay, that's a centroid, right? Once I have done the assignment, now I need to adjust, right? So like compute the new centroids based on the objects that are assigned to my cluster. Okay, so those are the new one, okay? Now once I have that, I redo my assignment. I keep doing this. When do you stop? When would be your, like, stop and say, I'm done? So I try 10 times, I'm done. You can set a T, right? But ultimately, what you're looking for is that your clusters are stable, right? Stable means that if there's no change at all, like say, after the previous round, I did my assignment, I did the new centroid, right? Centroid is the same, so that means the assignment will be the same. That means, okay, stable, right? I don't need to change anymore. That's when you stop, okay? So that is the generalized case when you want to stop, but not always, right? Sorry, let me. Okay, now, if you look at, right, the efficiency or the computation complexity, okay? So we're using these 3 terms, right? N is the number of objects, K is the number of clusters, and the T is the number of iterations, okay? So basically you're doing this, right? So for each iteration, you go through each data point, that's N, right? And then for each data point, you need to go through the K, right? You need to compute which one and then make the decision, okay? So that's your computation complexity, okay? All right, but also, right, as we said, this is a heuristic method because every time when you do the assignment, you just assign it to the nearest centroid, right? So intuitively, that should work, but that may give you a local optimal, okay? So that can terminate at a local optimal. This is particularly dependent on your initial centroids, right? So people have tried different ways. For example, like, yeah, I know you're choosing random ones. So maybe instead of just one set of a random seed, right? Now you can try multiple, okay? Or you can use utilize the domain knowledge, right, to have some good initial centroids, okay? So it doesn't, one, take too many iterations, or will stop at a local optimal scenario, okay? Also, this is important, right? This is why it's a k-means, because you have a way of defining centroid, meaning that you can take, right, multiple objects and compute the centroid. Okay, so that means numerical data, right? Okay, so you need a way of defining the centroid. Otherwise, this wouldn't work, okay? Also, you need to specify k, right? Because here it assumes that you would give me a k ahead of time so I can choose, right, among the different centroids. Of course, you can say, oh, yeah, if I don't know k, so maybe just go and try a different k. Yes, you can do that, right? But there are like approaches where you can help you to refine, or have some kind of either domain knowledge or have some way of calculating the best k value to use, or the hierarchical approach, which can adapt to your data set. Okay, the next one is actually important, okay? And I have this figure, I have this figure up here for a little bit. So just to illustrate, right, what do we mean by this? Remember with our assignment, right? We're assigning data point to the nearest centroid, okay? With that, do you think my k-means method can I find two clusters like this? Would it work? If you had, like, somehow your data set has these two clusters, right, with this red one in the middle and this blue one in the outer ring, would your k-means method find this two clusters? Yes or no? Okay, if you think about it, right, for this data point, right, if you, like, say, for example, like, if you have this one as a cluster, this one as a cluster, since I'm choosing the nearest centroid, right? So if you're closer, like, so basically you wouldn't be considered closer to the point on the other side. Rather, you'll be considered closer to the center cluster. So if you run this, you actually have this more like a half kind of sliced like cluster, one side, right? So for example, like if you draw a line somewhere, you say like this half is one cluster, the other half is another cluster, okay? That's because k-means cannot discover cluster with non-convex shapes, like this donut setting, okay? So that's important, right? So that's what I say, like, when you look at your particular, like, problem setting, like, do you expect those kind of clusters? And then you may not be able to use k-means, okay? One more. It's sensitive to noise and outliers. Why is that? How I'm computing centroids? Centroid is the mean, right? The average or the algorithmic mean of all the data points assigned to this cluster, okay? So if you have, like, say, most of these data points here, and then you have another point that's further out, okay, but somehow still considered closest to this centroid, to this cluster. Now you compute the new centroid. This point will be pulling the centroid away, right, from the majority of those data points, okay? And that actually can, like, actually skew your centroids, because that may actually pull out further, as I said, it may actually pull out and now be closer to another side. And that actually may confuse your clustering process. So, okay, we said that, okay, so k-means is sensitive to outliers. What can we do? Okay, turns out k-medoids is actually like a reasonable approach to tackle this challenge, okay? Why is that? Okay, so the key idea with k-medoids is that instead of computing the centroid, right, which kind of considers everybody, I will pick an object. So the center, right, or the cluster representation is always an actual object, okay? So why is that, like, better, right, for noisy data? So that means even if you have, right, in my earlier example, right, if you have a cluster, like a lot of points here, and you have another point way out, right, if you use a centroid, it will pull out the centroid computation. But then if you're using objects, right, apparently you will still pick an object that is close in this area, right? Because the center, right, in the k-medoid method, the center, the object, right, is closest, the aggregated distance is smallest to everybody in the center. Okay, so you would still pick something that is in the core of this like group, rather than being pulled out of the cluster here. Okay, so that's a high level idea. Okay, but then how do we find it, right? So now instead of, like, computing the new centroid, now you need to compute a new object, right? Find this new object that is now at the center of your new cluster, okay? We're still doing the partitioning. We're still doing these iterations, right? But just now within each iteration, okay, I have actually more computation, because now I need to go through each object within the cluster, okay? And then find one object that is really at the center, meaning that its combined distance is smallest, right, to other points. Okay, so in our illustration here, so for example, right, so I have all those objects, okay? Now, if you say I'm reassigning, so this is the data object, this is a cluster center, so those are I have 3 clusters, okay? So before swapping, so that means like originally P will be assigned to Q over J, right? So that's my initial, right, or previously, the class assignment, okay? Now I want to try to whether I can assign it to another one, right? So you can say either I pick now reassign to this random. Okay, so I pick another object, right, to be the cluster I will be assigned to, okay? So either say I have no change or you need to make like adjustments, right? So instead, once you made that change, then maybe other objects now need to be moved, right, to the new center of the object you have picked, okay? So process is very similar to k-means, but I now need to do a lot more computation because earlier everybody is comparing to the centroid, which is a single value, right? But now I need to compare, basically do this pairwise comparison, okay? It's about, like say if there are 100 objects in this cluster, right? You compute your distance to all those 100 to determine which one, right? Or which object would become the new center, okay? So computation is more expensive, but it is applicable when you don't have a numerical value, meaning that you don't have a way of computing centroid, or you have a lot of noisy information that you're dealing with. Okay, so later on, people actually have like tried some way to make it a little bit more efficient. Okay, so the original approach, right, so it's the PAM, so partitioning around the midways. Okay, so that means like I start with some initial midways. Okay. And then I basically try to iteratively replace midway with a non-midway if it reduces the total distance, right? As you can see, right, to compute this, you have this n minus k raised to the square. So that's actually a lot more like computation expensive compared to like the k-means method. So that's slow, okay? You cannot do that for large data sets, okay? So later on, people have like tried a few things. First one is simple, like instead of running the whole data set, right? Say, okay, let's do samples, right? Because the idea is that if you have a sample set, and if you do have clusters, right, the sample set would still hopefully represent, right, the clusters you're looking for, okay? So you're reducing the number of objects, but hopefully we'll still find similar clusters. Okay, but because the sampler, sometimes you do need to run this multiple times, right, to make sure you have a stable clusters. There's another one further, right? They use like a randomized sample to search for neighboring solutions. So that means I have my samples, right? But when I'm looking for like to change, right, change my center of the midroid object, so I try to search in the neighborhood. Okay, so because ideally you wouldn't be making major changes, right, when you go from one iteration to the other. So in a way, you're looking at your neighborhood, right, trying to find the new center, okay? So you're using this kind of like a randomized sample in your neighborhood so that it allows you to quickly or more efficiently identify the new center. Okay, so I have 3 minutes. Okay, so we'll quickly cover the idea of a hierarchical methods. Okay, so as the name suggests, right, hierarchical means that like I don't do one level of clustering, I do multiple. Okay, so with a hierarchical clustering, okay, there are typically 2 approaches, right? Either you're going bottom up or you're going top down. Okay, so what I talk about is whether you are like combining things into clusters, or you're splitting clusters into smaller ones, okay? Either way is fine, right? So you can start with a whole data set, okay? Like iteratively, like find the splitting point so that you have smaller clusters and smaller clusters, okay? Or you start with each object being in a single cluster, okay? And every time just combine, right, 2 clusters that are closest to each other, okay? So with hierarchical clustering, we usually use this what we call like dendrogram, okay? Just a way of showing how the clusters are being combined at the different levels, okay? So in this case, right, I have A, B, C, D, E, so these are 3 data points, right? And also have, this is their like similarity score. So that means at the very top, of course, within the cluster, everybody, you just have yourself. So that's the most similar one, right? Everybody is similar to themselves, okay? So as you combine clusters, right, apparently they are not as similar. So that means like there's more diversity in your cluster, okay? So as you get bigger clusters. So now the question is really that, okay, how do you combine things, right? So typically when you look at those individual clusters, you have some way of computing the distance between the clusters, okay? So in this case, for example, I would say A and B are very similar. So I'll combine A and B first, right? And also D and E are also quite similar. So next time we combine D and E. And next, C is close to the DE cluster. So I'll combine C with the DE side. And finally, that's my total cluster with everybody, okay? So now to do this, right, of course, like the benefit, right, is that, hey, yeah, I don't need to specify K. That's great, right? And also, you have a way of like using some kind of a distance, right? Because you need a way to compute the distance between clusters, okay? So you can do this as like some kind of centroid distance if you can compute centroid. If not, then you do some kind of pairwise, right? Because you have data points in this cluster, you have data points in the other cluster, so you're looking at the pairwise distance, okay? I think we're out of time, so we'll stop here, okay? And we'll continue later, okay? So quick reminder, homework 5 is out. Please finish the midterm exam scheduling survey so that we can finalize the schedule for midterm.